They have a man, an abuser, sit at the head of the circle and deconstruct a moment of violence, and it takes hours. It takes hours, and they'll have him recount the whole story once and notice how his body was moving. So he hunched over, or his muscles clenched, or his voice got loud, and it's a universal sort of bodily expression.
Rachel Louise Snyder is the author of Fugitive Denim and What We've Lost Is Nothing, the latter of which Library Journal named an outstanding new voice in fiction. Her most recent book, No Visible Bruises, received the Lucas Work in Progress Award from the Columbia School of Journalism and Harvard's Nieman Foundation. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and the Washington Post, among others. Diane L. Rosenfeld is a lecturer on the law and director of the Gender Violence Program at Harvard Law School. Prior to teaching at Harvard, she served as the senior counsel to the Office of Violence Against Women to the U.S. Department of Justice. She was also an executive assistant attorney general in Illinois, advising legal policies on women's rights, environmental enforcement, and the ethics of governmental attorneys. Tonight, they're here to present Rachel's new book, No Visible Bruises: What We Don't Know About Domestic Violence Can Kill Us, which was praised by the New York Times as extraordinary. And fellow author Eve Ensler calls it a seminal and breathtaking account of why home is the most dangerous place to be a woman. We're so pleased to have them here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Louise Snyder and Diane Rosenfeld.
I'm so happy to be here. This is my alma mater. You know, I lived in Boston for grad school. I went to Emerson. I come to this city and I just feel smarter. Just the creative people at Emerson would sometimes walk through Harvard to just be like, oh yeah, we're smarter now. It's great. So it's good to be back. Anyway.
And really good to have you, and great to meet you. And thank you all for coming out to hear about this fascinating new book, and also for braving the weather. But we're used to it. We're tough. You know, we
I'm not
live
tough.
in Cambridge.
I'm very soft.
So I first heard of Rachel's work a few years ago when she wrote about a raised hand in the New Yorker, and it was a really deep dive into questions about how is it that domestic violence is so present and so important, and yet so ill-considered in our public policy and our daily lives. How do we have a society where it's tolerated at this level where we lose 4 women a day in this country to predictable, preventable acts of homicide by the people who are supposed to love them? So I've just met Rachel for the first time tonight, and I'm so happy to meet you, and I'm a great admirer of your work, and I haven't had the chance to read this yet, but I'm really excited to talk to you about it and hear about it.
I'll give you the Cliff Notes.
Okay, you can give me the Cliff Notes. So
It's bad out there. It's bad.
it is bad. But I think it would be lovely if you would read a few passages from the book and give us a sense of the book before we all buy it, and we'll take it from there.
Okay.
We'll have a conversation and then open it up for Q&A.
That sounds excellent. Yes, I apologize on behalf of the Dubuse siblings who collectively got bronchitis, and I actually thought it was my fault because I saw Suzanne last week in New York, and my daughter had strep throat, so she texted last night and was like, I think I might have strep throat. I was like, oh, I'm the carrier. And then today she texted, is like, no, it's bronchitis. And I was like, yes, I mean, that's terrible. That's terrible. Hope you feel better. So I'm sorry that the Dubuse folks couldn't be here, but we'll get them another day. So one of the things that I felt like was so important with this book, you know, I have an MFA in fiction, which is ridiculous when you don't think about the intervening 25 years of, you know, journalism that I have sort of learned on the fly. But I read a lot of really great literary journalism, right? Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc and Random Families is an incredible book, and Matthew Desmond's Evicted, and you know, Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed, and Alex Kotlowitz. I could go on and on. You know, the kind of journalism that is like policy changing, but also as immersive as a novel. And I really wanted to write a book that would be that way, because you know, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone in this room. We've not really been paying attention to domestic violence very much in the last, like, I don't know, 400 or so years. Actually, we can go further back than that. The last however many millennia. But from a fiction writer's perspective, the real challenge is, how do you write something that's compelling when you know the end of it, right? One of my former grad students is here, Brian. Hi, Brian. We would talk about this. He took literary journalism with me. Like, when you know the end of a story, you're relegated to facts, which it can be really challenging from a writing perspective. So it took me about 5 years to figure out what the heartbeat of this story was. And in some ways, the heartbeat is the benefit of hindsight, all the places that we could have seen something that we were not seeing. So I'm just going to read like a couple of little paragraphs about, the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is called The End, and it's about a family in Montana who the husband kills his wife. She's 23 years old, and then kills his 2 children, and then kills himself. His name is Rocky, and her name is Michelle. Just to give you a sense, I guess, of how it's written. And also, just to preface this all, it does actually get a little happier at the end of the book. It's not all sad.
But it might be a good idea to also give a trigger warning that hearing this can be really triggering. And I want to note for everybody that self-care is underrated and extremely, extremely necessary. Not just important, but actually necessary. I was quizzing my new friend Rachel about what she does for self-care, because dealing with this, you know.
Yeah, she's like, "Hi, I'm Diane. What do you do for self-care?" I'm like,
for self-care?
I have a martini like this. I'm like, oops.
Anyway, so that's your trigger warning.
Yeah. That's the next book. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. Okay. Rocky was a wiry guy, 5'5" and high-strung, jittery, energetic. His family describes him slightly differently, as quiet and sometimes devious, also on the shy side. Before he shot himself, he took years of family videos, packed them in a bag, and put them in the garage. He wanted to be sure they'd be saved, homage to a happy American family. If it had all gone as planned, that might have been the story that survived, a great American tragedy. He'd written a message on his arms. No one was meant to see it, and no one can exactly remember what it said. Something like, "I deserve to go to hell." There are dents in Paul's front door. Paul is Michelle's father, the woman who Rocky killed. There are dents in Paul's front door, he tells me as I meet with him, from a time Rocky tried to beat it down to get to Michelle. But at the time, that didn't really register to him as violent, not dangerously so. It's the kind of violence that seems so difficult to evaluate in the moment, but crystal clear in hindsight. Which is to say that this is precisely what domestic violence looks like. Paul is hardly alone in his failure to register the portent of it. But imagine it's not Rocky at Paul's front door, beating at it, kicking it, screaming for a woman inside. Imagine it's a stranger. Who wouldn't call the police? Who wouldn't try to intervene to stop the violence? And yet, when it comes to people we know, people we see in other contexts, as fathers, brothers, sons, cousins, mothers, whatever, we have trouble registering the violence. Now, Paul says he'd intervene, he'd do something, take the law into his own hands somehow. It's a Montana thing, the libertarian, individualistic culture of the place. He doesn't trust the system, doesn't think the police really did much to save his daughter, or the prosecutor. One thing I want to tell you that'll give you insight into Montana, Paul says. When he asked for the autopsies of the family, the coroner said he could release only those related to Paul by blood. Michelle, Christy, Kyle, but not Rocky. But when Rocky's father, Gordon Mosier, asked, he got them, all 4 of them. The point of view is the man owns it, Paul told me. The patriarchy sets the rules. Paul shakes his head. The more you think about it, the more it'll piss you off, he says. He pulls out a brown accordion file and shows me the 3 autopsy reports he managed to get. Kyle's report begins, "This young boy is received with blood saturating the clothes." The coroner noted that the decedent had recently eaten gummy candy. Christie's report said her gunshot wound followed a pattern of metallic snow. Her heart weighed 180 grams. Over to you.
All right, really, really important points about patriarchy, ownership, and marriage. And the legal history of all of this makes a big difference, because it used to be that women were just legally chattel. And your legal history lesson for tonight is as follows, and Rachel knows this, having been a former student of mine. It's all you need to know about law and domestic violence. If a man killed his wife, it was legally exactly the same as if he had killed a stranger. If a woman killed her husband, and this is according to Blackstone's commentaries in the mid-17th century, if a woman killed her husband, it was an act of treason for which she would be put to death. And that's really kind of all you have to say, because it was as if she had risen against her king, and patriarchy and patriarchal social order is all about men designating other men as kings of their own private castles. So this is also an agreement of non-intervention. And non-intervention is a huge theme of law enforcement, because they respect another man's right to do what he will in his own castle. So that's what lets this go on and on and on until now. And I think that your book could not have come at a better time in the context of the Me Too movement, and how important it is to really seize this moment and look at how law and policy need to be informed by Me Too and by women's voices and by the reality of what's going on the ground. And that's what your book is doing, and so vividly and thus painfully, and thus why you have to do self-care. But the question of, yeah, of course, if this was a stranger, the police would come and somebody would call the police. But when it's your wife, it's also your property and it's your right, and nobody's going to intervene. So what do we do, about that?
I mean, there wasn't, and by the way, for people standing, there's like a chair here, there's like four chairs here.
Come sit.
Yeah, come sit. Come dance.
Okay, sit in the back. We won't pick on you. I won't call on anyone tonight.
I might.
Okay.
It wasn't really until the 70s that even the literature, the research started to say something other than that. If there was violence on behalf of a husband toward a woman, it was because she had brought it on herself.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I was alive in the 1970s, so this is not that long ago. We didn't have a federal law banning spousal abuse in this country until 1984, 20 years after the civil rights movement. I live in Washington, D.C. We didn't have a law against beating one's spouse in Washington, D.C. until 1991. I was in college then. I mean, it's shocking to me to think like my mother was in a relationship with my father and he could have legally beat her.
Right.
He didn't, but
Right.
he could have.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really interesting to put it in that context, because a man beating his wife, his property, has gone from a legal entitlement and actually almost an obligation under the statutes of chastisement to a legal prohibition. So in the long game, we're pretty early, but we're actually not that early anymore, and we need to move on this, and we're done. I'm forming the Done with Patriarchy party if anybody wants to sign up for that. That's my platform
I
in
have
2020.
4 brothers, and I'm going to give away 3 of them tonight.
All right, so would you like to read another section?
Yes, I will
Maybe
read it.
isn't
I will.
so.
Let me read a section from the patriarchy, shall I?
Yes, please.
What a transition. Wow. So one of the things that I wanted to do in this book was I didn't want to just write from the viewpoint of a victim or from the victim stories, because if we have any acquaintance at all with domestic violence, and that's questionable, that's the acquaintance that we have. And I feel like, and I don't know, maybe other people will disagree with me, but I feel like batterers have a context from which they come as well, and I'm someone who wants to just hear everybody's story. Like I talk to every Uber driver that I come across. I talk to like the lady who sells my dad donuts. I talk to everybody. So, so I spend a lot of time talking with men in batterers intervention groups or sitting in on batterers intervention groups. And so I'm going to read this section that takes place in California. There's this program that's been going there for a long time in a jail called San Bruno Jail, and they actually have a domestic violence wing, and it's highly sought after from abusers because it's known as like a peaceful wing. There's no fights there, and it's a year-long program, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's pretty intensive. And one of the things they do that was just fascinating to me was they have a man, an abuser, sit at the head of the circle and deconstruct a moment of violence, and it takes hours. And they'll have him recount the whole story once and notice how his body was moving. So he hunched over, or his muscles clenched, or his voice got loud. And it's a universal sort of bodily expression. And for nearly all of these guys, it's the first time they've ever sort of seen what they look like in context, and it's fascinating. And they do that with the language. They deconstruct the language and talk about how so many of them minimize this moment of violence, or they talk about sort of sensory things that are going on, or is there alcohol involved, drugs. It's fascinating. And at the end of every day, this is so California, I'm just going to throw this in there. At the end of every day, they do yoga together because, of course, it's California.
That's great.
Yeah. So I'm there as a journalist, and they're like, "Ma'am, would you like to do yoga with us?" And I was like, who would say no to that? I mean, of course I want to do yoga with you. So anyway, so this is a small section that if they don't finish the program in jail, if their jail time is too short, for example, they'll finish it at the sheriff's office in San Francisco, a sort of satellite office, although it becomes then just once a week. So make of that what you will. So this is just a couple of paragraphs on the night that they're going to do one of these. It's called a separation cycle exercise. And it's run by two guys, Dante and Jimmy. Jimmy is a former pimp in California who is a facilitator of this program, and he used to actually be a prisoner in this jail. So some of the guards, knew him when he was a prisoner, and now they know him as a facilitator. And he's great. He's bald, and he has tattoos of all of San Francisco's like major tourist sites on his head, and he's missing like 7 or 8 teeth. And my little daughter FaceTimed me once. She was like 8 or 9, and I was out there, and here's Jimmy. This guy could not look more intimidating. And he's like, "Hi," and she's like,
Mom, what are you doing?
I know. She's like, "I'm gonna call the police, Mommy." So anyway, so Dante and Jimmy. Dante gathers dry erase markers and wet wipes. Participants wander in slowly, as if this is a kind of torture for them, which perhaps it is. "Who's the scribe tonight?" Dante asks. One man in sunglasses with teeth grills says it's him. Writes on the blackboard, "Separation cycle exercises. Denial, minimize, blame, collude." Some of the men arrive straight from work, others from wherever they've been hanging around all day. They nod to one another, crack a one-liner here or there. Someone whispers to the scribe. He laughs, says, "Shit, man." Then he turns to me. "I apologize for my language, ma'am." It's like a play in which the actor suddenly breaks the fourth wall. Another one laughs and says, "Check it out, Fatal Peril Club right here." They understand fatal peril as the exact instant when a man's sense of expectation is most threatened, what the world owes him, what his own sense of self demands. Something challenges him. Maybe his partner says something or does something, and he reacts. Maybe a guy in a bar insults him. Maybe some coworker tells him he fucked up. It's a split second that changes everything. Eyes narrow, chest pump, fists clench, muscles tense, blood rushes. The body language is almost universal, running across race and class and culture, sometimes even species. A man, a lion, a bear. The body reacts the same way. Fatal peril. A moment that Jimmy and Dante hope to eventually show these men is a decision. Violence as a learned behavior. We don't know it, but we have another word for fatal peril. Snap. On the news, the mourning neighbor, the crying coworker, he just snapped. But the snap is a smokescreen, a cliche, a fiction. The snap doesn't exist.
Great. So the point that violence is a decision. It's not this uncontrollable urge that men have to be violent.
Yeah, I mean, most violent people are not violent out in their world or at their jobs. They're violent toward one person. Only about 20%, 25% fit that idea that we think of, like monster,
right,
or, you know, rageaholic or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah, most
right.
of them know perfectly well how to act.
Right.
Yeah.
And betters don't react to their bosses the way that they react to their spouses.
Right. I'll tell you, one of the guys that went through this group and who's a facilitator now said when he learned this about his body, the way his body moved, instead of like walking into the violence, he just took a step back. That's all it took for him to like snap out of a moment, was learning to take a step backwards rather than forwards. I found that amazing.
That is amazing. Yeah, I mean, our bodies can learn different reactions, like learning to breathe when you're having an anxiety attack is an example of that. And it also brings up the really important question of what we call better intervention, and how effective is it. And the research is kind of split on it, but it's not, you know, the larger question is, how do you align the responsibility for the crime of domestic violence with the criminal, instead of having the victim run for her life and reinforcing that through systematic channels, like having an order of protection that you don't really expect to work because he's a highly dangerous person. So it's only going to work if you maybe are in a state that has GPS monitoring for high-risk domestic violence offenders, like we do in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Yay. But when there's a residency component, it really strengthens the better intervention efforts. And the reason that we haven't been able to tell through research how effective better intervention programs are is that they don't have any other factors in the program that really require adherence to the program and impose consequences for not following the program.
Right. The only consequence is you go back and start again.
Right. Or you don't. Yeah, but it's often not. It's enforced in a very spotty way through judges. Yeah. So to have it along with a residency requirement is really important.
I know. Instead we put a residency requirement on the most dangerous, like the women, victims in the most dangerous situations. I mean, we tell women to leave, right, and to go to shelter. And it was shocking to me to learn that shelter was an inadequate response. I mean, I never gave it a thought one way or another, like, is it a good response or not? And it really wasn't until I came to Massachusetts. I was doing my first New Yorker piece on a group that you have here called the HighRisk team, who kind of divide out the most dangerous situations and try to build protections around victims, not only to keep them safe, but to keep them out of shelter. And because I really didn't fully appreciate what shelter means, right? Even the best shelters most of the time means you're all in one room. You're leaving your family pets at home. If you have aging parents, you can't care for them. If your kid plays soccer, well, not while you're in shelter. You most of the time can't hold a job, right? Because the shelter has to be secret. So there's all kinds of problems. And then, of course, they're under-resourced. There's very few shelters take men, for example, who are victims of abuse. So they're problematic, and I look at the world in some sense through a literary lens. So to me, like getting back to the problem of why this is never talked about, because our first answer was to take something that was seen as a private problem and make it a private problem in a different place.
Right.
Right? Just relocate the problem, but don't solve it in any way.
Right.
Yeah.
I completely agree, and our work aligns on that very strongly. And I wrote my LLM thesis, and it's called "Why Doesn't He Leave?" And it's about realigning interests and redistributing liberty interests back to a victim of domestic violence, because systemically we ask and expect a victim to leave her home at the time that she most needs to be in her home, safe and supported. And as a criminal justice system, we say, oh no, here's your order of protection, ma'am, and here's a number.
It's bulletproof, this piece of paper.
Yes, and on the back is 3 shelters that you can call and see if there's a bed available.
Yeah.
And we're at that moment in time, from a government perspective, offering protection at the same time that we're breaking that promise that we can protect you.
Yeah.
Because if we could protect you, you wouldn't have to be running for your life. And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, imagine someone breaks into your house and the police come and say, well, I'm sorry, but you need to leave your house. But the thief is going to take up residence now. Like, it doesn't make any sense, right?
It does in a patriarchy, but like I said, my political party is we're done with patriarchy. It's the DWP party, and we're done. But Kelly Dunn. So I've worked with the Greater Newburyport HighRisk Case Management Team that we started in 2004 in Massachusetts, and I'm really proud of Massachusetts because this group in Newburyport that you featured in your first article on this has created this model that is now followed all over the United States. It was followed 25 times. There are 25 teams in Massachusetts that follow this high-risk model, and we had 3 communities: Amesbury, Newburyport, and Salisbury, and we had this coordinated community response to really protecting domestic violence victims from further escalation by imposing consequences on the batterer and by using GPS monitoring. So for high-risk domestic violence offenders. And my theory on this is that you treat all domestic violence cases as potentially lethal. And you ask just a very few number of questions, and you can really parse out which ones, like, has he threatened to kill you? Does he have a weapon? Do you think he will kill you? Do you think he could kill you? And then you screen in as a high risk. And if you're high risk, then he's got to be stopped. It's just that simple. It's just that we haven't really controlled the reins of law enforcement yet so much.
And I want to say, too, that the reason this book is called No Visible Bruises is not just because it was saved in my computer that way for a long, long time, but in fact, so much of domestic violence is not visible to the naked eye. I mean, the woman who was eventually killed, who is in the first part of this book, her that's your other mic.
That is my
That's
other
your
mic. Fell out of my pocket.
That's your backup mic. Her husband went to the Rims in Billing, which was on the outskirts of the city, and got a rattlesnake and brought it home and kept it in a cage. And that's how he kept her in line. Just when you think you've heard it all, right? Her family never saw evidence of physical abuse. She did file one affidavit that said that she had been abused, but he didn't have to. If she would do, prior to him having this snake, if she would do something that he didn't like, he would take the kids and go camping for a night or go to a motel and disappear. So he had all the control he needed, frankly.
Right. I wanted to say that Kelly Dunn, who is one of the originators of this team, had said in like 2007 that the cases that are the most dangerous are exactly the ones where the women are going to shelter, because she's running for her life. And we don't treat it that way. We treat it as, she has to go to shelter because
problem solved.
Otherwise he's going to kill her. So this book, is mandatory reading for everyone. And we have to think about pursuing new answers to this, because the current situation is absolutely unacceptable.
I just want to ask, like, how many people here, just show of hands, have known a victim of domestic violence, have seen domestic violence up close, have possibly been a victim of domestic? Like, look at the hands here, right? Like, well over half the people in attendance. I mean, it's just like, how is our government not doing anything? I mean, and I will say, because I realize I don't have a timepiece here with me, so I have no sense of. I'm in like a Joseph Heller novel right now. Oh, look. I also don't have $1 million. What was I saying? Oh yeah, this is, like, I haven't even been on the road that long, but I keep doing things like I tried to order a glass of water from a woman on the train. I was like, oh, I'm not on a plane, and she's not a flight attendant. I'm on a train.
Was this a random woman, or?
Yeah, I went like this, like.
Can you get me some water?
I was like, oh God, thank God I stopped myself. Yeah. Some of the fixes that we need to make are big. Certainly some of the policy changes that we need to make are big, but like there's so many things that we can do that are really incremental, right? One of them is GPS monitoring of abusers, particularly prior to, post-arraignment or prior to, arraignment. Another thing we can do, like in Montana now, after Michelle and her kids were killed, one of the many changes they made was that if you are arrested for domestic violence in the state of Montana, you cannot see a judge until after lunch. That's it. That's all they did. And it seems like, well, how could that help? That gives a domestic violence advocate enough time to get to a victim, create a safety plan, change locks if they have to, arrange for GPS monitoring for an abuser. There's all kinds of things. Take them to a shelter in extreme cases. There's just all kinds of things that they can do with that little tiny amount of time. And there's changes like that all throughout the book. In fact, I want to just mention one person who's here tonight who I'm not going to, look at. I'm just going to look around the room. I spent more than a year interviewing her. She was in one of the most dangerous situations I have ever encountered as someone who's been researching domestic violence for 10 years. And she was in a kind of witness protection program here in the state of Montana. And she's here tonight. She's free. She's safe. I'm super happy she's sitting among you.
That's great.
Yeah.
So should we open it? Do you want to read any more of your?
No, they should all buy it.
They absolutely.
It's so good.
They absolutely should all buy it.
So my daughter just turned 11 is like, Mommy, can you please not tell me any more about domestic violence for a few years?
Yeah.
I was like, oh shit, sorry kid. Yes, I will not. Yes, let's open it up to questions.
Great.
First of all, I think you deserve a lot of credit, and I'm really glad that your book has gotten so much attention in the press, because you are very effective at dispelling some very prevalent myths about domestic violence, which is very useful. I mean, I've seen it in the New York Times, I think, and the Atlantic, and Fresh Air. So that's great. You'll sell a lot of books too. I and some of our colleagues here in Cambridge, which also, by the way, has a HighRisk team.
I know you do, and I've sat in on
Belmont.
sat in on batteries intervention groups here in Cambridge too.
Well, I think it's one of the oldest battery.
Yeah.
I think they stopped using that name, Program for
Yes.
Men Who Use Abuse.
Yes, that's true.
But I'm concerned about an over-dependence on the legal response. And I think when you say we really have to pay policy attention to this, since 1975-ish, there have been continual efforts to pay policy attention to domestic violence, and it's very difficult to get it right. And in a certain way, we've moved further and further into the criminal justice response, and it hasn't worked very well from the point of view of a lot of victims. So I'm nervous about moving further in that direction, which it sounds a little, I haven't read your book, I have to say. I've only read stuff about your book, so this may be an unfair assessment of what you said. That there have to be ways, and I think you've named some of them that you've seen in action in different places, that aren't just coming down harder with the criminal justice response. For instance, prosecuting without the victim, I think was the headline of one of your articles. because that has a lot of the policy changes we thought were the right thing to do have had a lot of unintended consequences.
Right.
As policy changes almost always do.
Mm-hmm.
So my sense is that since 1975, there's been a rather continual effort with some very creative moves. The HighRisk teams are one of them, and there are many others. And some moves that seem very creative in the moment and turned out to be very creative but have a lot of unfortunate other effects. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a question. Anyway, because I think, because you bring up such a good point. It's true. I had there was a little excerpt in the New York Times last Sunday on evidence-based prosecution, and it's so funny because honestly, if you read the book, that it's like 4 paragraphs in the whole book, and that New York Times is like, that's what we want to run. I'm like, really? Like, that's okay, like whatever. And one of the things that you're talking about in terms of our response that has just completely backfired is mandatory arrest policies, which we created about 15, 20 years ago. And now there's a lot of states where if they get a domestic violence call, there's a mandatory arrest statute. And if they can't figure out who the aggressor is, they just end up arresting both parties, which is a problem. Right, I mean, we can see that. So yeah, there's problems like that I think are coming to light more and more. I will say that you know, when I think about the long view, like just take America, you know, it's only been in the last 25 years or so that we've even had any kind of question about stopping violence at its root. I mean, we've only had about 50 years of trying to deal with it in a post-violent event. So half that has been our attention to sort of stop violence at its origins. And so in that way, I feel like it's a brand new kind of field of research, and it's going to take some time. I also agree that, you know, arresting somebody and putting them in jail, at least in the jails and prisons that we have today, is not offering reform. It's why I think what they're doing in a place like San Bruno, which is what they call an all-program jail, meaning you can go there and you can get college credits, you can get a high school diploma, you can learn all kinds of different, you know, trades and whatever. It's why I think we need to have more resources put into events like that, or programs like that. But there's also a program I was just telling Diane about in Israel that I'm hoping to go write about, that has, if you've been charged and found guilty of what we would call a domestic violence misdemeanor, you go to essentially a halfway house and live among other men who've also been charged, and you can keep your job during the day, so it's not going to economically debilitate you, but you're there for at least 4 months. It varies depending on the seriousness of your charges, and while you're there, you learn gender education, you learn cooking and childcare, you learn about all the invisible work that are so often women's jobs, right? I mean, I'm you know, a divorced mother, and I'm still doing all that invisible stuff, like the schedule and everything. So to me, that, I haven't done the research on that particular program, but it sounds really promising, that kind of, you know, programming.
Yeah, and I would say just really quickly that law enforcement is a part of it, but just like there's the most effective way to address this is through a coordinated community response. It takes everyone, and it takes a real demand on the system to change the system, and we haven't really had that in a collective way. And the hope of this moment with this book and the Me Too movement is that we could really get our voices heard in a collective action demanding way right now.
How come even since the Violence Against Women Act came into existence, how come not all men who get restraining orders against them end up in jail or in some form of rehabilitation program?
I think our jails would be more overwhelming than they are today. I think it would just be, you know, and the other thing is we don't have a national database to track stalking or people with restraining orders. So if someone in California gets a restraining order and they move to Iowa's not going to know that or have any sense. So that's one of the problems too.
And the Violence Against Women Act, what it does essentially is give money to states who have coordinated community responses to domestic violence. It doesn't, it helps law enforcement, but it doesn't do what you're thinking it should.
I came in the middle, but I think that one of the big problems, in answer to your question, is that remember when they had the ice bucket challenge? My friend died of ALS, and at the point where she died, I didn't know one person, including us, who knew what the hell Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS was. Then come the ice bucket. If you put something on everybody's little Facebooks and gadgets and all that, not just on TV anymore, because TV's only for us old timers. But if you get it out there where the people are tweeting, including that thing in the White House. Do you see me physically get?
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway.
Yeah.
I'm about-
No, I live 3 miles from that thing. I hear you.
But if you get those things tweeted out and you start reaching people about domestic violence, because I remember, and I go way back, I remember going to a woman's, huge demonstrations. They would be about abortion, they would be about this, that, and the other, but they never went near violence against women and never took seriously that it is a crime. And people can laugh talking about it. I don't see how, any more than people should laugh talking about killed children or murders or anything else that is violent. And it's so prevalent. And I've heard husband and boyfriend after husband and boyfriend say, there's other cultures where men give their lives. It is now, and I'll never forget the relief during the 70s, the mid-70s, about 77, when people started at women's groups, which were much more outgoing than these demonstration things where nobody ever went near it. And they started saying, and then on the radio, you could hear every 3 minutes a woman is brutally beaten by her husband, boyfriend, or lover, question mark. And the shock has to, it's become normalized because it's hidden, and it needs to be not just in a book that people are going to read who come in or go to Harvard or come in the Harvard bookstore, but something that's up in the faces of the American people, so that people come out and really start to do actively, as activists, participate in making things better.
So there is, in October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and unfortunately I don't have my phone on me, or I would look it up, but I think it's going to be October 8th. There's going to be a national die-in, it's called, and the woman organizing it her name is Joanne Tucker. She's in New Mexico, and she's hoping to bring it national, where essentially she wants, activists, people from all over, whoever wants to be involved, to lay down on the steps in front of their government, offices on one specific day. And she also wants to bring artists and singers and dancers in. And
It's going to be worldwide.
well, right now she's just talking about the U.S., but
That's wonderful when that's,
yeah, I mean, maybe,
everybody
right?
knows that.
Disseminate the information. I can't. I'll try to get my phone later and remember what it is, because my memory is terrible. But it's called a die-in. It's gonna be October 2019.
Do you have advice for friends, relatives, concerned, bystander intervention? What have you?
Yes, I actually have a couple of things to say, and that's been in some ways the toughest question for me, and one that I really wanted to think about. And some of you in the audience might have different suggestions as well, Diane. So feel free to jump in. But the first thing I would do is not be afraid to gently probe a little bit and just ask pointed questions that are more direct, because my sense of a lot of victims that I've talked to is that they know they're in danger, but they don't know how to contextualize that danger necessarily. So there's a website called, why do I try to remember? Dangerassessment.org, I think. Dangerassessment.org.
Okay.
Or com. It's either com or org. And they have the 20 questions on there that are indicative of the highest risk categories for domestic violence homicide. So for example, you might have a friend who you suspect is in a situation, but a punch is categorically different than being strangled or being choked in terms of the danger assessment. So that's the kind of information that is on there. The other thing that I feel like is to get people to share their own stories. And as a journalist and someone who interviews people, one of the ways, here's one of our tricks of the trade. I repeat their own language back to them, and it automatically forces them to go deeper into the story. So for example, if one of your friends comes up to you and says, I don't know, Xavier was, I don't know, he was mad last night, or things aren't going well with Xavier. I don't know why Xavier. You might say like, going well, not going well, right? Like just repeat their words back to them, and it kind of automatically makes them, go deeper into the story. So that's where I would start with those three things.
And there are also resources online. I'm on the board of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They have good resources, and like Rachel said, you could print out a danger assessment and talk to your friend about it. I did this years ago with a friend of mine in Chicago. Upper middle class, white, privileged woman, and she looked at it and we went through it, and she was really shocked because she said, I've never considered myself a battered woman or in a dangerous situation, and it really it can be a very powerful change moment where somebody can then get some help.
If they're in a very dangerous situation, I know a couple other questions, but just one, two more questions, one or two. Okay. If they're in a really dangerous situation, one thing you can do is there's on that same website, dangerassessment.org or .com, there's a couple of apps that they can download that will go automatically like to 911, but if their phone gets taken from their abuser, there's a thing in the app. I'm so not technological, but there's a thing in the app that automatically switches to like Spotify or something like that, so that their abuser doesn't see that they've just called 911 or whatever. Yes.
I work for DCF, which is Child Protective Services, and I'd say more than half of my cases are DV involved because in Massachusetts, police have to report to DCF if there's a problem. Frustratingly, I usually face women who have a lot of fear and shame and, oh no, I just dropped the phone on my face. Like, how many phones? These are big phones. So I was wondering if you have any words of wisdom on how I can gently try to break through that shame, but also kind of quick so the kids aren't exposed again and again and again and again.
There's a couple of chapters in this third section of my book where I go around with this Cleveland detective who she's a domestic violence high-risk detective. And so she's going into houses that are like where women who have been nearly murdered like hours earlier, and there's almost always kids around, and she is incredible to watch in person, like just her like demeanor and how she deals with the mom and the kids who are going. Anyway, you'll have to read those sections. I'm not an on-the-ground advocate. I'm a journalist, so I don't know that my answer is going to be as useful as Diane's. But again, I think reminders that it's not their fault, reminders that that it happens to 1 out of every 3 women, that 4 women are killed, that 20 people are beaten every minute in this country, 20 people. This sense of not being alone, I feel like is so important, because you do feel like you're alone and maybe a little bit crazy. Like, are you making a bigger deal of it than it is? Like, are you, because you're gonna, it's not just physical abuse, it's demeaning, right? You're hysterical, you're insane, you're this, you're that. Like, those thoughts get in your head and you think, am I? And so even hearing someone say like, you're not crazy, no one should ever write to talk to you like that, here's a danger assessment, right? Like, look at the danger assessment. I guess I would give sort of the same answer.
Yeah, the power and control wheel is also a great resource, as is the
Oh, yeah.
equality wheel,
Mhm.
to kind of contrast with that. So he's had his hand up for a while, and she had her hand up for a while.
Yeah.
I had two quick statements, or I have a question for you, but statement towards her, towards social media and
Mhm.
pushing it. I feel that we can spread the awareness like all over social media, but half of the time it's either memed about. I don't know if you guys know what that means. Like, for those who don't know, a meme is like when you joke about the topic and people put like a woman getting beaten and then like make a joke underneath it. And that's what social media tends to do. And I feel like when you post it on social media, it's not taken as seriously. And I feel like, oh, all right, so you're spreading the awareness. What are you gonna do about it? That's it. Oh, I'm gonna just share and like it.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
really solving the issue. I feel like I like the idea. I like that you can spread it, but nobody's really doing anything about it. And a question for you was, this is my first time meeting you and everything, so I don't know. Like,
It's my first time meeting you too. Oh my God, already we have so much in common.
Yeah, more like first time hearing about you. Just doing this for a class project. I just wanted to know what motivated you to do this type of research and book, and who did you look up to, or like what made you passionate about this, pretty much?
Well, I was a foreign correspondent. I lived overseas. I lived in Cambodia for 6 years. I lived in London for 2 years before that. I've traveled to 50-some countries. My 11-year-old has been to 22 countries. We're big into traveling. And I always did stories that had some kind of humanitarian or social issue connected to them. I felt like, you know, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an attorney. Like, the thing I have is writing. Like, that's what I have. And so those were the stories I did. And when I moved back to America, I met, you know, Suzanne Debus, who has bronchitis tonight and is unable to join us. And she had put together this high-risk team to try to predict domestic violence homicide before it happened in order to prevent it. And it blew my freaking mind. I was like, how can you do that? That seems crazy. And so I followed her around, like, all over Newburyport. I'm like carrying her peaches, I'm carrying her beer. I'm like, what else can you tell me about this? I just couldn't believe that, A, that someone had created this, and B, that we could like have an effect on something that seemed so embedded in the culture that it was banal to me. And as for why I'm interested, I don't really have an answer other than that, like, no one else seems to be. And I don't know. I think it's like a secret, and I'm tired of it being a secret, I guess. So,
Great.
one last question. This is Kay. She hired me from Cambodia to Washington, D.C., so it's her fault. You know, there's more mosquitoes in D.C. than in Cambodia. You did not tell me that at our interview.
I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I just have a question about what it was like for you trying to talk to the people you interviewed, who were, I interested mostly in people who you might call victims or perpetrators, or
Yeah.
people who really had been involved in one of these situations. And how did that work for you as a researcher?
What was it like for me to talk to people, victims or perpetrators? You know, again, like, I come from a family of people who talk to everybody. Like, I go to Walmart with my dad, the Supercenter Walmart in Arizona, and it's like, he knows everyone. Like, we go eat lunch at the grocery store and all the sample ladies know his name. So that's the kind of family I come from. We just talk, even when people don't want to talk to us, we talk to them. But I also feel like I'm authentically able to say to someone, your story matters, and I will listen for as long as it takes for you to tell your story. I was telling Diane earlier, you know, it was so important for me to get the viewpoint of abusers, not because I feel like I want to excuse them. Of course I expected them to lie to me and to put on their best behavior, like, I know all that. But I also know that none of us want to be relegated to our own worst stories. And Rocky, you know, the first family in the book who end up being killed, Rocky's parents talked to me. It took me a year to get them to agree to talk to me. And I spent, the first time I met them, I spent 7 hours straight talking. And, you know, I record, but I also take notes. And at the end of those 7 hours, all 3 of these fingers on my right hand went numb for a month. And I had to get acupuncture to bring the feeling back in my hand. And I just thought, well, that's a psychosomatic biological response to some 7 hours of trauma, you know? So I think I'm just honest with people. And I say, like, you know, you can tell me all the bad stuff. I'm not going to judge you. I've done a lot of bad stuff myself. You know, I was a pretty violent teenager. I mean, and I beat up a girl once because she wouldn't move on the bus for my friend. It turned out she was a twin, and I beat up the wrong one. But it, you know, that's not. And I got suspended for that. I'm not proud of that moment, but I understand the impulse. You know. I think that's probably all we have questions for. But I'm happy to sign books or whatever.
I think you're amazing, and I'm so proud of you. And